Hi, I'm Jamie Stuckey, and this is my story of how God got hold of me. I grew up in West Virginia, which usually generates its own set of humorous comments and smiles. My folks divorced when I was 6, and custody was given to my mom. We had twice a week visitation with my dad. Mom and Dad did a great job of dealing with the divorce with my brother and I. Never were we in the middle of an argument or made to feel on the spot. So it was really, as far as divorces go, one of the easier things to deal with. Dad was awesome. He stayed involved. We saw each other regularly, and if there was a time that he was out of town, he was calling on the phone. So I never had a time when my father was not in my life, which is really a blessing. We went to church every Sunday. Mom took us, and I grew up believing in God. Never knew any other option, really. When I was 13, my mom took my brother and I, and we moved to Texas, a place where Mom and Dad had lived right about the time I was born. And Mom wanted to go back there, so we went and lived there for about 6 months. It was there at that place in geography, at that place in my life, and at the church that we attended, that for the first time I understood the gospel. I won't say it's the first time I heard the gospel, but it's the first time I understood the gospel. The first time I understood that I had to do something with this Jesus, that just believing in God wasn't enough. The church we went to was the kind that offered an invitation at the end of every service, an invitation to go forward, to pray the prayer of salvation. Finally, at one service, the three of us, my mom, my brother, and I went up. I went up because they went up, essentially, and we met with someone at the front of the church, and we prayed the prayer of salvation. And I remember standing there with my head bowed, holding hands, and waiting for everything to change, waiting for lightning to flash and thunder to boom, and nothing happened. So in my what I thought then, very logical 13-year-old mind, what I thought was, well, it didn't take. That's all right. But now I knew. So we went on back home. Obviously, since I didn't think anything took, and since it didn't seem to be real, nothing changed for me except for the knowledge that I had to do something with this Jesus. For the next, really 5 years, I struggled, avoiding those thoughts when you're alone of what are you going to do with this Jesus. We ultimately moved back to West Virginia, stayed in Texas about 6 months, moved back to West Virginia, and I finished out my high school career there in West Virginia, wondering at night in those still quiet moments, what was I going to do with this Jesus? How in the world could I be a Christian without telling anybody, because I was so scared that if I became a Christian, it meant that I had to walk up to people I didn't know and ask them if they knew where they were going when they died. And I was shy and terribly afraid of doing anything remotely like that. It scared me when people did that to me, and the thought of doing that to somebody else was just unthinkable. I can't even sell a Girl Scout cookie, much less tell somebody that they need to decide what they're going to do with Jesus before they die. Graduated from high school, and I had all my plans of going to a certain college in Ohio, when my dad had a good discussion with me, and he said, "Jamie, if you want me to pay for your college," and I didn't have money of my own to pay for college, so, having Dad pay for college was a good option. And he said if I wanted him to pay for my college, then my options were to stay in West Virginia and go to a local community college there for a couple of years, and then reevaluate, or come down to Florence, because that's where he was living by this time, working for DuPont. I could come down to Florence and live with he and his wife, Marilyn, my stepmom, get in-state rates, not have to pay housing, go to college that way. And I didn't know a whole lot, but I knew that West Virginia didn't have a whole lot of opportunities. And I knew that South Carolina was a good place. And I knew that I would love to get to know my dad better, to see him on a more regular basis than I had in the past, to find out what it was like to live with married parents. Up until the time that Marilyn went home to be with the Lord, Dad and Marilyn were married for about 30 years. It was beautiful. So I came on down to South Carolina, and everybody was worried that I was giving up all my dreams and my plans. But the cool thing is that God knew so very much better. Came down in August, and my sister, my older stepsister, whom I adored and had adored since childhood, really, invited me to revival at her church. Well, I went. I mean, how do you say no? No, I don't want to go to revival. I don't want to go to your church. I said yes, and I went. I went that first night, and the second night, and the third night, and the fourth night, and the fifth night. And it was torturous because I already knew that I needed Jesus. But at these kinds of revivals, which are good old-fashioned revivals, it was pounded on each night, as it should be in that particular style. And we laugh about it now. But that last night, every head really was bowed and every eye probably was closed. And we sang Just As I Am, like the 38th verse. And I'll be dog if that preacher didn't say, I know there's one more out there. I was like, oh, it's me. I know it's me. I know it's me. And I told the Lord that I would go up if my brother went up. And at just that moment, somebody came and invited my brother to walk up with him. And I said, well, gosh, I don't know much, but that could be the Lord answering that prayer. It took every bit of courage I had to walk that very long walk up front. But that evening I did what I hadn't done all along. And all my figurings of trying to figure out how to be a Christian on my own terms, how to be a secret Christian, how to do it without actually having to do it. That night, I completely surrendered. That was the missing ingredient. I had not done that yet. I had not fully rested my weight on what Jesus had done. And that night, I knew peace for the first time. And that night and every night since then, really, I've enjoyed the peace of a night of being able to go to sleep, of not struggling with these deep thoughts that can't be reconciled because I hadn't done what I needed to do. Once I had come to Sandhurst a couple years later, it was so refreshing to find out you don't have to walk to the front of a church to be saved. That was how God needed to get me at the time, but that's not how it has to be every time. And that was just really wonderful. But the Lord knew I needed the presence of another person to make me more accountable in that moment. And He's been growing me. That was I tend to say now, that was my emotional surrender. My intellectual understanding and surrender came a couple years later when I really did have to work out, does God really exist? Not that I had spent my whole life believing in God, and so God just is, because I've always believed it that way. But now I needed to know, why did I know that I believed in God? And it was a trying time, but it was a strengthening time, and I needed that, and the Lord brought me through it. So the emotional surrender came that day in mid-August, right before I started college. The intellectual surrender came about 2 years later, no doubt partly as a product of the college experience, but it was necessary for me to think it through, for me to know where I stood and why I stood there. And sometimes when you're going through that, a lot of times we want the confirmation first before we make the decision, and sometimes we have to make the decision and let the confirmation come afterwards. And after I had thought everything through and narrowed it all down, I decided that since I can't give my life to anything halfway, and I can't give my life to anything unless it's exactly most right, best thing that it can be given to, then of all the options out there, Christianity was the best choice. And should something happen, and I get to the end of my life and I had chosen wrongly, then I still chose the best of all the options that were out there. God gave me peace through that, and it occurred to me, kind of right after coming to that conclusion, that God didn't exist because I believed in Him. He would exist whether or not I believed in Him. He didn't need my belief in Him to exist, and should I have chosen against Him, He would not have crumpled up and blown away like a dry leaf. And I needed to know that He was so much bigger than me, that much bigger than me. I'll never know how much bigger than me He is, but it was good to know that the universe and all its turnings didn't depend on me. That sounds so selfish and self-centered to say, but I needed to know that there was something bigger than me out there.